Here we go. Let's talk about Africa. All right. It's a huge and diverse land, the second largest continent in the world after Asia. It's surrounded by multiple bodies of water, including the Mediterranean Sea up top and north, Atlantic Ocean, we've got the Indian Ocean, we've got the Red Sea, so it's surrounded by water, like any other continent. Connected to Europe and Asia through a small piece of land connecting it to the Arabian Peninsula. So right here, it's going to be connected to the rest of the world. But it's still connected by these relatively short bodies of water, so there's definitely contact across these shorter bodies of water, but by land there is an obvious connection. As far as climatic zones, we've got the Sahara, this large desert here, and I do mean large, you can fit the United States inside that desert. As a result of that massive desert, there's limited contact with the rest of Africa for thousands of years just because it was that difficult, nearly impossible to cross the desert. And so limited contact when it comes to people living up here and people down here. Just to cross that desert took thousands of years to advance and figure out how to do so. We get multiple fertile areas, fertile as in areas where you can grow food, along the Nile River. And so you can get, in this area, food will grow here, and the southern border right here with the Sahel, the semi-desert zone. So food will grow there around the desert, but the desert's going to be difficult without water. The Sudan, which is sub-Saharan Africa, kind of this whole chunk of Africa. We get grassland, which is savanna, and so savanna is in kind of the light green here, and rainforest areas in the darker green areas. So people will be living in these areas, and this is where most West Africans will live, in the savanna. And so these regions where there's water, but not too much jungle, need a lot of population. Then down south, you get another desert that's more sparsely populated, the Kalahari Desert. Here's an example showing a population density map as of 2000. The darker areas have more people, lighter areas have no people. And so you can see the Sahara, not many people live in there. The Kalahari, not many people. But areas where there's savanna, highly populated. Areas where there's water, fresh water especially, more highly populated. Another physical map kind of showing mountain ranges instead of just as far as where people could live and where people could not. Another example of the different deserts, the Sahara, the Sahel, which is kind of the medium, and again the Kalahari. And Madagascar's got it all, singing animals. And you also notice along the Nile River, nicer areas where you can farm. This allows the Egyptians later on to take over. This is known as the birthplace of humanity. Paleoanthropologists, a lovely word, which is the study of the evolution of humans, have found that the origins of humanity lie in the savannas of Africa. This is where we as a people started. And this is based on fossil and genetic evidence. So we've been using genes recently, but also just digging up the bones of our ancestors to determine how far we go back and where we start. And so this evidence points to a common ancestor 5 to 10 million years ago, this common link of all mankind. Hominids, and so we're all hominids. It's the biological family of humans and our ancestors. We go back to 4 million years ago. The earliest we've found is Australopithecus, or Australopithecines is the type, 4 million years ago. Then we move on over the course of millions of years of evolution to the next stage, Homo habilis, 2.4 million years ago, where we've developed larger brains, and we start to use stone tools for the first time. And we start to use those for hunting and shelter construction. So this is a major point where we're splitting off from animals and becoming human. Homo erectus, and so we've got more like a chimpanzee, but somewhere here would be Australopithecines. Homo habilis, right around here. Homo erectus, right around here, is the first use of fire. Again, where we're separating ourselves from the animals, using fire to cook, better our lives. And we're starting to spread to Eastern Asia, so we're spreading across the planet now. Up to modern Homo sapiens, 200,000 years ago, up to the present, where we're spreading across the entire planet 100,000 years ago, and we start to replace other hominids as the new dominant hominid. So these other hominids were likely existing at the same time, and we wiped them out as we were dominant, had bigger brains, and used tools and all that fun stuff. Two theories as far as how did we start and how did we spread? We've got the Eve hypothesis that all humans came from one African woman and then migrated out to Africa. So basically it's the idea that all of our evolution takes place right here, and then we spread. The other model, these are both hypotheses, we're still finding the evidence on this. The multi-regional model is the idea that archaic human populations spread out, exchanged genetic material along their journeys, and through the exchange of genetic material, that means reproduction, that we're able to evolve simultaneously into humans. So all these different hominids spread and eventually come to the same conclusion that, hey, let's be Homo sapiens, over a long bit of evolution. So let's take a look at, first we evolve and then we start to create these massive civilizations. So let's take a look at some of the big East African civilizations. First we have the Egyptians, the most famous. We all know the pyramids. They moved from a more nomadic style, moving around, to agricultural, which allowed for an increase of hierarchy and specialization and more complex society, as opposed to just a smaller tribe that moves around. They settle down and really build something bigger. Founding role in Western civilization as the first major civilization, and really major foundation there. The Nile River allows for farming and transportation. Otherwise, if they were just in the desert, they would not have settled in these areas, but because of the Nile, they allow for more farming. And if they can farm, they can increase their population because they have enough food. If you can't farm, you have no food and you die out. And so with this river, they can farm along the coast. They can move along easy transportation with their boats. Plus, they have the bonus of the desert. By being surrounded by the desert, that's a bonus in that nobody's going to really invade easily. To invade, you're going to have to cross a pretty nasty desert. And, if you actually survive the desert, then you get to the battle. So, in many ways, they're walled in by the desert, but also protected by it. So it's a double-edged sword. Their ethnicity is debatable. It's a fun modern debate as far as what race they were. Likely it's a mix in that they were interacting with Middle Eastern peoples over here, as well as African peoples over here. And so likely they were a mix, but it's still debatable as far as exactly what they looked like. They unite their kingdom around 3150 BC, and they'll go through 31 dynasties until finally the Romans show up, Antony and Cleopatra, and they absorb them into the Roman Empire around the year 100 BC. As far as the religion, the pharaohs or kings claim the status as gods on earth, and they have a society with a complex hierarchy of warriors, priests, merchants, artisans, peasants, and so they're really building an entire civilization as we know it, as opposed to a smaller village, something larger where everybody has a unique role. It is a very patrilineal meaning the ruler goes from father to son, and patriarchal, and as in male-dominated society. So it's a man's world, very much so. The women have a higher status than the rest of a lot of the other ancient civilizations. That women could own property, were allowed to educate their children, hold public office, they can serve as priestesses, they can run their own businesses. And there are a few cases where they have female rulers, such as Hatshepsut, difficult to say for me. And she even had a little beard that she would tie onto her face as a symbol of power, even though she was a woman. The religion is polytheistic, but with two big gods. Ra, the sun god, here he is. Ra, the sun god, representing the immortality of the Egyptian state, that their government will always last, as the sun will always rise. And then Osiris, the god of the Nile, the immortality of the individual, that the Nile will always flow. Pyramids are built to protect the bodies of the pharaohs, so they're kind of grave sites, but also as symbols of power, and that they're mighty emperors and kings. Other civilizations in the area. Nubia, south of Egypt, in more modern Sudan area, they may have come up with the idea as far as grain production and monarchy, but that kind of backfires as the Egyptians take the idea, develop their society, and then they come right back and conquer them around the year 2000 BC. In return, after they're conquered, they're required to provide copper, gold, ivory, leopard pelts, and slaves to the Egyptians. And then there's a bit of a system similar to Japanese feudalism, where the sons of the nobles, the Nubian nobles, the sons are expected to go up to Egypt, and they must live in Egypt as hostages. That way, basically it's to prevent war. That the Egyptians have their sons. If you mess with us, we'll kill your son. Eventually, when they're older, the sons return home. They spread Egyptian culture, and this encourages them to become more Egyptian. So later on, this culture spreads because of this hostage situation where the kings of Nubia will call themselves pharaohs, and they'll be buried in pyramids, smaller pyramids, but pyramids nonetheless, because of that Egyptian influence. Eventually, they form an independent kingdom of Kush around the year 1000 BC, and they expand the territory until eventually they actually take over Egypt and large areas of Egypt until the Assyrians show up in 663 BC. So it's back and forth when it comes to sharing of culture. Meroe. The Kushite nobility, they remain independent for another 1,000 years. And here's some modern examples of kind of what's left behind. They were speaking the Egyptian language and practiced this religion, kind of that give and take from the last slide. But eventually the Egyptian army shows up, destroys the capital of Kerma in 540 BC, so they move south to a new capital at Meroe. It's a better location for trade with East Africa, with Sudan to the west, with the Mediterranean through the Nile, although they probably have to pay a tax through Egypt. And they trade really well. And so this economic expansion leads to less dependence on Egyptian culture, and they can kind of stand on their own because their economy is doing very well. And so you can see that in what architecture is left behind, as it's influenced by that trade. So you get Greek and Indian and Egyptian and sub-Saharan African styles in their architecture over time because of trade and a strong economy. And because of that strong economy, eventually the Romans show up and say, hey, they've got piles of money and we would like to have that money. And so they're invaded, and then they start to just work together, and the Kushites start to really depend on the Romans for trade, as the Romans were pretty wealthy, and so they trade and trade. But as the Roman power declined, as Rome got weak, because they were so dependent on them, the Kushites got weak too. So eventually the Kushites are conquered by the kingdom of Noba, who were conquered later on by the kingdom of Aksum in 400 CE. So when that trade is cut off, their economy collapses, and they're easily conquered in what is modern-day Ethiopia. Conquered by a Semitic people from the Arabian Peninsula, influenced by Hebrew culture to form in Ethiopia this first Christian state in sub-Saharan Africa. So Christianity starts to spread across the Arabian Peninsula. And these shifts in trade, shifts in trade as far as who they're trading with and how powerful they are. Environmental depletion in that they may have been farming areas too aggressively, as well as the rise of Islam and Islamic invaders start to reduce Aksum's power by around 700 CE. So they last a couple hundred years before, just like the other empires before them, they fall for multiple reasons. So major things, major vocabulary. You should know the savannah, the Sudan, hominids, Homo erectus. You should know a bit about ancient Egypt and kind of all the cultures that were offshoots of Egypt and developed on their own in the area. Pharaohs, maybe even want to learn a little bit about some of the female pharaohs such as Hatshepsut. So there's a little intro to Africa and all its size, as well as the major empires of East Africa.